Okay, good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome to the fourth Shiur in the series on Sefer HaMadah of the Rambam under the aegis of the Kehilah of Riverdale. So, the first mitzvahs with which Rambam starts are mitzvahs of belief. We know that everything in this book is going to be cognitive in some way, but the first ones were about belief. Right? Believing, it was about coming to know that God exists. It was about not even considering the possibility of another divinity, affirming the unity of God. But the next two mitzvahs, while still cognitive, begin to move in the direction of worship, even though practice is not going to be considered yet. Namely, the mitzvah to love God, v'ahavta Hashem Elokecha, and to fear God. And obviously that's going to be important later on for the attitude, the cognitive attitude with which one enters into worship and other actual practices, even though, as I say, the practices are not going to be discussed until the second book of the Mishnah Torah. So we need to understand what this love and fear are, and how Rambam believes they are to be attained. And what's striking is his statement in the second halacha of the second chapter, that the way to attain the love and fear in God is through the study of the natural world. Right? He's very clear about this, right? And he doesn't mention anything else. And that is very striking. So the first thing to note, to some extent I'm recapping, but I'll move on to things that we didn't talk about before.
Meaning he doesn't mention Torah.
Does not mention Torah, so I'm going to come back to that. Yes. So the first thing to note is that love and fear are intellectual experiences. They are cognitive emotions. And they are intimately connected, and love is primary. Right? So, first of all, you come to love God by appreciating His great and wondrous works and creatures. And then you obtain a glimpse of the divine wisdom, which is infinite. Remember, the proof of God's existence went from nature to the necessity of an infinite cause to the existence of that infinite cause. So that's the same path that he's following now, starting from nature. And then Rambam says, anybody who does this will straightaway love him, praise him, glorify him, and long with an exceeding longing to know his great name. So there's an emotional reaction to this knowledge and this passage from nature to its infinite cause. And he says, when he ponders these matters, he will recoil affrighted and realize he is a small creature, lowly and obscure, endowed with slight and slender intelligence, standing in the presence of him who is perfect in knowledge. So from the love, in the movement towards from nature to God, comes fear in the return to oneself. But it's not fear of punishment. It's awe. It's humility. It's feeling that, you see how great and infinite God is and how small and finite I am. That's the sense of fear here. Now, strikingly, at the very end of that halacha, he alludes to a rabbinic statement, which he explains elsewhere. Right? So he says, this is the way to come to love God. And he says at the very end, Kamosha Amru Chachamim, just as the sages have remarked, Be'inyan Ahava, in connection with the love of God, Shemitoch Kach, that through that, or in this way, Atom Akiras Misha Amavahaya Olam, you will recognize the one who spoke and the world came to be. Now that's very remarkable, because we're going to see in a second that the Rambam cites this very same midrash that he's citing in even very briefly here in another place, and it's not at all clear how he gets from that to the idea of studying nature. And in fact, in Sefer HaMitzvahs, which the Rambam wrote before he wrote the Mishnah Torah, so that's his comprehensive account of the 613 mitzvahs, he says something a little different. So this is on the handout in 2c. This mitzvah of loving God consists in contemplating and reflecting on his mitzvahs, his utterances, and his actions. Now, his actions, for the Rambam, does mean natural actions. But before that, he mentioned the mitzvot and the ma'amarim, the commandments and utterances of God. Right? Until we apprehend him and enjoy the apprehension of him to the extreme limit of enjoyment. This is the love that is obligatory. So there's a difference between what Rambam says in Sefer HaMitzvahs, where he does mention the study of nature, but only after the study of Torah, and what he says in the Mishnah Torah, where he doesn't mention the study of Torah at all, he only mentions the study of nature. He goes on to cite at greater length the same midrash that he mentioned at the very end of the second halacha of the second perek, and this is from Sifrei Dvarim, Piska Lamed Gimel. And these words which I command you this day shall be upon your heart. Why does it say this? Because it goes on to say that you should love the Lord your God with all your heart. But I don't know exactly how we're supposed to love God. What does the mitzvah really mean? Talmud Lomar. So the pasuk says, that's why it's connected. It mentions the heart in both places, so that you should know that the way to love God is through the things that are on your heart, which are the words, the dvarim. Right? Notice that's the same language as the Rambam cited. Through that, atamakir as HaKadosh Baruch Hu medabek bidrachav. Through that, you'll come to recognize God and to cling to his ways. Now, it would appear that this Sifrei is about Divrei Torah. It's about Torah study. It's not about the study of nature. So, how do we understand Rambam's understanding of the Sifrei, and why does he change his account when he comes to the Mishnah Torah and omit the study of Torah?
So this is Sefer Mitzvah. What is this?
Yes.
This is Mishnah Torah?
This is the Sifrei.
So this is Sifrei Dvarim.
Yes. Which he cites, however, in the Sefer HaMitzvahs.
But he doesn't mention this ever in Mishnah Torah.
That's what he's citing at the very end of the second halacha, but only the end bit. So he's citing Sifrei, but he doesn't cite all the rest of it, which is about the words that you put on your heart. Divrei Torah. Mm-hmm. So those are the two questions that I want to try to resolve. So people have tried to answer this question a number of different ways. I'm not going to go through all of them. One way in which many people try to resolve differences between Mishnah Torah and other works of Rambam is to say, well, Mishnah Torah is a work for the public, whereas some of his other works, like the Moreh Nevuchim, are really works for only certain elite readers. Clearly that won't work here. We've seen that he says very radical things at the beginning of Sefer HaMadah. And he doesn't have any problem saying those radical things. And here too, the most radical thing is in Mishnah Torah, not in Sefer HaMitzvahs, for whatever. So I don't think any approach like that is going to work. I would suggest it has to do with the nature of the work and the way it's organized. So let's distinguish between several different ways in which you could organize a book. So one way is to write a systematic treatise. You organize everything according to principles. And I would say Sefer HaMitzvahs is meant to be such a work. First, Rambam establishes certain principles. Then he classifies all of the mitzvahs, the positive and the negative mitzvahs, in accordance with those principles. And the idea is to be comprehensive and systematic. Sefer HaMadah is not a systematic work in that way. It does not start out with principles of classification. That's not the point of Yesodei HaTorah. Right? It is meant to be comprehensive. It is what I would call an axiological work. Axiology is the study of values. Rambam wants to tell you the most important values in the order of their priority in the Mishnah Torah. And the highest values are not Jewish values in any particular sense. They are universal values. Remember that when Rambam said the first of the Ten Commandments is to be understood in terms of the proof of God's existence from the eternity of the world, which is not the Jewish belief. Right? That was because he aims at everybody. And he understands those first two of the Ten Commandments to have been understood through reason alone. And that's how he understands the Gemara that says that Bnei Yisrael heard the first two commandments mipi hagvura, directly, as it were, from the divine mouth, which he understands to mean from reason, not by means of a prophet. Right? So we are dealing here still at this point in Sefer HaMadah entirely with universal values. It would be out of place to speak about learning Torah. We have not talked about the specific prophetic power of Moshe Rabbeinu yet. We've talked only about Moshe as doing what? Yeah, having perfect mastery of physics, which is a universal achievement. So until we talk about the prophecy of Moses, we're not going to say anything that's particular to Judaism. So it seems to me. And I think that's why he omits the study of Torah here. It's not because he doesn't think that the study of Torah is a way to come to love God. It is. But that would be out of place to mention here. Only later on could one begin to take that approach. And I think it's essential to the Rambam's project that the universal values have priority. And everything particular will have to be arranged in terms of those universal values and justified in terms of those universal values. So that would be my main answer to it. Why is the study of Torah a way to come to love God? My brief answer to that, which we may have time to lengthen in future weeks, is that the greatness of Moshe and of the Torah is that it is an imitation of nature. And this Rambam explains in the Moreh Nevuchim. The human problem, the existential human problem, is that we are not one nature at all. We are two different things linked together. We are an intellect and we are a body. And there is no such thing as human nature, therefore. There are two different natures. And the combination of the two is a political problem. So we need a law that comes from elsewhere, not from the human realm, in order to make the body subsidiary to the intellect so that the human being can achieve perfection. And the greatness of the law of Moses is that it follows the path of nature. The Torah is like an imitation of nature. It follows the same principles of gradualism and subtlety. And studying it, from the Rambam's point of view, is therefore akin to studying nature. So there's a way in which I want to say that studying Torah also leads to the love of God, as he says in Sefer HaMitzvahs, because of the way in which the Torah is an imitation of nature, which implants in us the common nature which is missing. Yeah.
So the Torah is a imitation of nature. Nature
Yes.
precedes. It's not like some, people would say where, the Torah was the blueprint of nature.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
I don't know any place where Rambam discusses that midrash. One could find room for it, perhaps. But the way I understand the first two chapters of the guide, the Torah is responding to the problem of the human condition. And it's doing so by...
So it's a response, therefore.
Yes.
It's not a...
Right. Again, you could say that the problem was foreseen and therefore the response was ready. But
they addressed that it was created. But,
yes,
but
right.
In terms of the way the Rambam's laying it out now, it's definitely an imitation coming after nature and responding to nature.
Yes. I mean, I could also put it differently. I could say that the Torah gives rise to a human nature, which is an imitation of the first nature. But maybe that would be a more accurate way to put it. So when I say the Torah, I mean the effect of Torah on the soul is a second nature, and that's an Aristotelian term. You habituate yourself in a certain way, you acquire a nature. So that's not something that we were created with in our present condition, being intellects and bodies. So we need the Torah in order to implant that second nature in us.
We acquire the nature maybe if we follow the laws of the Torah?
Yes. Right. But we don't have it in the first place, and that's the human problem. But maybe that would be a more accurate way to put it, that the Torah helps us to achieve a second nature. So for that reason, I think that one can reconcile what Rambam says in Sefer HaMitzvah with what he says in the Mishnah Torah, but you can also see why he omits it here, because that is a specific Mosaic and Jewish response to the human problem. And study of Torah is not commanded to all people. Now, this theme of the love of God, which as we've seen is primary, takes precedence over the fear of God, is in many ways the major theme of the entire work of Sefer HaMadah. And you'll see that because it comes back right at the end. So at the very end, and I've put all this under number 3 on the handout, of Hilchos Tshuva, the laws of repentance, he returns to this idea of love. And this is the transition to the next book of the Mishnah Torah, which is called Sefer HaMadah, the book of love. So love is going to provide us with the transition from the cognitive realm with which Sefer HaMadah deals to the practical realm with which Sefer Ava and the rest of the books deal.
So there's the cognitive and the affective. So the cognitive would be the head, what we know, and then the love would be affective.
No, they're all cognitive for him.
Even
yes.
Love is cognitive.
Right, absolutely. Otherwise it would not be in this book. It's a cognitive attitude, a cognitive emotion. Yeah. So in Hilchos Tshuva 10:2, he talks about what it is to be someone who worships or serves God out of love. Ha'oved me'ahava, one who worships out of love, osek b'Torah u'v'mitzvahs, will engage in the study of Torah and the observance of the commandments, v'holech b'nesivas ha'chochma, and follow the paths of wisdom. Notice that it's all three, so there's the practical part, there's the study of Torah, and there's also nesivas ha'chochma, which is presumably the other sciences. Lo mipnei davar ba'olam, not because of anything in the world, v'lo mipnei yiras hara, not because of the fear of some evil, lo kadei lirasha tova, but not because of the inheritance of something good. Ela oseh ha'emes mipnei she'emes, but he does the true thing because it is true. So it's done for its own sake. But sofa tova lavo biglala, and it's the good will come of its own accord, but that's not the reason for doing it. There is good that comes, but that's not the reason. Umala zohi malagadolam od, and this degree is a very great degree indeed. Ve'ein kol chacham zochala, not every wise person merits it. Vehi malas Avraham Avinu, and this is the level of Avraham Avinu. Shekra'ah HaKadosh Baruch Hu ohavo, whom HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God called his lover. Right? Avraham was a lover of God, or his beloved, because the fisha lo avad elamiava, because he did not worship except from love. And this is also the level that we were commanded, that God commanded us through Moshe. So he returns at the end of the book to what we were just saying near the beginning. So as soon as you have that cognitive attitude that is appropriate, then you'll also do all of the commandments from love. And that's the right motivation. Not because of gain and not because of fear of punishment, but because of love. I think it's important that he mentions Avraham here, because for Rambam, Avraham is a philosopher. And as he explains in the guide, and it's based on Midrashim as well, that Avraham came to the existence of God on his own through reason, through reasoning on the basis of nature. So that's different from the prophetic experience, which he had later on, but that's not how he came to God according to the Midrash. So the basis of this love is philosophical, but it's also commanded to us by the Torah of Moshe as well. And it's a cognitive attitude that will lead into the right kind of practice.
Is there any connection between doing Torah Lishma with this ahava?
I think that's the same thing for him, yes. That's the language of doing what is true because it is true. I think that's how the Rambam would explain it. Doing it for its own sake. So in the third halacha, he goes on to say, "V'keitzad hi ahava haruya." What is this proper love? Hishi yahav es Hashem ahava gedolo yisera azamahod. You should love the Lord with an exceeding great and very strong love. Ajitei nafsha kshura be'avas Hashem, until his soul is tied to the love of the Lord. And the language here becomes very erotic, and of course it's reminiscent of the Platonic tradition in the Symposium, and the idea of an intellectual love. And he'll find himself in a constant tremor, as if he was sick of love. He was sick with love, lovesick, right? As if you were in such a state that your mind could never be free because of your love for a certain woman. And he's continuously agitated about her, bein b'shivta, bein b'kumo, whether he's sitting down or standing up, bein b'shashu, ochel b'shosa, whether he's eating and drinking. Hashem. Even greater than that, even greater than the love for another human being, is the love for God. Belev ohavav, in the heart of those who love Him. Shogim ba tamid, they're meditating constantly upon Him. Just as it was commanded to us, with all your heart and with all your soul. And this is what King Solomon said by way of allegory: Ki cholas ahava ani, I am sick with love. He says all of the Song of Songs is actually an allegory for the love of God. Right, so that's how this love is meant to be. It's an intense and passionate love. And again, let's not forget, it comes at this point primarily through the study of nature. Although by the time we get to Hilchos Tshuva, it's also reinforced by the study of Torah, because in between, one of the sections will be on Talmud Torah as well. And then finally, in the fifth halacha there of the 10th chapter, he says, "Kol ha'osek b'Torah kadei lekabel schar." If you engage in Torah in order to receive a reward, or in order that you will not receive punishment, that is doing it for ulterior motives. But on the contrary, someone who does it not out of fear, presumably he means, again, fear of punishment there, not awe, and not to receive a reward, but because of the love of the Lord of the whole earth, which He commanded to us. So that answers your question. That's what it means to be occupied with Torah for its own sake.
But can't you have doing this lo lishma, but eventually it will come lishma?
That's what he goes on to say. Of course, you should always engage in Torah, even if you don't yet have the right motivation. Even if it's not for its own sake. So that's a famous rabbinic statement. From engaging in Torah for ulterior motives, eventually you'll come to appreciate it for its own sake. And there you see that that's a way to achieve the love of God. Right? So that's what he's talking about in Sefer HaMitzvahs. So by the end of Sefer HaMadah, he's prepared to say that in the transition from the book that deals with cognition to the books that deal with practice. So again, I don't think there's any inconsistency here, but it's a question of the order. Therefore, when we teach children and women, and of course Rambam's assumption is that women are going to get a much lesser education than men, and that's the case in his society. And in general, people who are not educated, you teach them to worship God out of fear. Again, he must mean here fear of punishment, and to receive a reward. Until their understanding develops, their minds develop, and when they develop a greater wisdom, then you reveal to them this secret, this mystery, ma'at, gradually. And you, in a pleasant way, you accustom them to this way of thinking, until they achieve it, and they worship from love. And I
understood growth mindset.
What?
Rambam understood growth mindset.
Okay, yes. Right. So I think, yes, it's true that he makes the assumption that women are going to be in the class of the uneducated, but what he's talking about is educating, and I think we shouldn't forget that.
Right.
He's saying everybody should get this education. Nobody should be left at the stage of worshipping out of fear of punishment or the love of a reward. Everybody is capable of attaining this appreciation. And that means, by the way, right, that all these individuals whom he mentions, including women, will have to understand physics to some extent. Otherwise, how is this possible? So I don't think, even though Rambam clearly would differentiate between the education of women and the education of men, I don't see any way in which you can avoid the radicalism of this. And we're going to see that he says that even the deepest matters of metaphysics, on the one hand, you've got to be prepared for them. You've got to be properly educated. But he also says everybody, and he mentions women, is capable of achieving that if they're given the right education.
So, Paul, would the Rambam say that you could really understand get a knowledge and love of God just through the study of nature?
Apparently, yes.
So then, in a certain sense, the whole argument, the whole, teaching Torah or not, it's sort of obviated by the fact that you could go the nature route.
Sounds like a shepherd.
A shepherd?
Yeah, in the Tanakh, a lot of very, devout were shepherds.
Right. Okay.
But
That's
won't
true.
the nature route lead you to Ahavat Hashem?
Yes.
Even if you go the nature route, eventually you'll get to Ahavat Hashem.
Right. So
That's
the question is, so then why do we need the Torah route as well?
I don't say why do we need. I'm just saying you could.
make
I
the
think
argument that women can go.
In principle, it's possible. However, Rambam thinks that it's highly improbable. There are specific individuals who are capable of doing that, but most people will not be able to attain the discipline that is required. First of all, you need moral discipline, and then you need cognitive discipline, and you need to live in a society that is ordered in such a way that it allows you to achieve perfection. The Torah does all those things for us when it's properly understood.
That's where he said. That's where it says, "V'lo kol chacham zochela." Then you could say, so you could be a chacham and understand nature and not really achieve that sense.
Right.
But Torah and mitzvah will get you that place, even if you start from the low lishma.
Yes. No, I think you're absolutely right to pick up that phrase, right? So there may be chachamim who do achieve it. Maybe Aristotle did and so on. But not every chacham does. Not everybody gets to that level for a variety of reasons, individual and social. Whereas the Torah, followed properly, imbues us with that second nature which involves moral discipline and cognitive discipline, and it builds a society that is intended to enable you to achieve perfection. Whereas the city in general is not set up that way. So yes, it's possible to achieve the love of God without Torah, but with Torah, it is much more probable, and it is properly intended. And then the last halacha of Hilchos Tshuva again is about love. So that now this is on the next page of the handout, right, 10.6. Davar yadu uvarur. It's a known and clear matter. She'ein avas hakadosh baruch hu niksharis b'libo shel adam. That the love of the Holy One, blessed be He, does not become tied up within the heart of man, ad she'yishgeh ba tamid kura'ui, until and unless he will constantly feel its proper tremor. V'yazov kol ma sheba'olam chutz mimeno, and he would leave everything in the world except for it. That's the nature of the command, that you have to love God with all of your heart and all your soul. But you cannot love God except with the cognition that you have achieved. Right. So this is the proper conclusion of the book. Right. You cannot have love of God without cognition, because as he understood love, it came from understanding nature properly. Right? And in accordance with the cognition is the love. If the cognition is very small, then the love will also be small. And if the cognition is great, then the love will be great. So a person must devote himself or herself to understand and to acquire intelligence in the sciences, and all the various reasonings hamodiyim lo et kono, that make his owner or his master known to him, in accordance with the power and the facility that a person has to understand and to attain, as we explained in the first unit, which is the one that we're studying. But I wanted to look to the end so you could see how the book is composed. Right? So ultimately, this notion of love that's introduced in the second chapter will be the transition to practice, but that can only happen in the proper way if the cognitive foundation is laid. And we go first from the universal, which is the priority when it comes to cognition, and only then to the particular.
So the first two, let's say, I am the Lord your God, and you know the God, those two are the universal? Does he consider
all of this is universal. That's what I'm saying. Loving and fearing God is also totally universal. There was nothing specifically Jewish about it at all.
And what about honor your father and mother, and all those are all universal?
Well, he hasn't talked about those. I mean, he's certainly going to commit himself much later on in the last book to the Talmudic idea of the 7 Noachide commandments. But these values, I think one could distinguish between the values and the commandments, right? The values that he's talking about are universal values. It would seem to me they should apply to everybody. And they're the cognitive basis for the 7 mitzvahs B'nai Noach, just as they are for the 613 mitzvahs of B'nai Yisrael, of the Jewish people. And in the next book, in Sefer HaMadah, then he will look at practical ways of internalizing this love, this intellectual attitude, right? So he mentions love in a few different times, regularly reciting Shema. He says, this is why it says V'ahavta. There's something about the regularity of saying the Shema, affirming the unity of God, that is a way of internalizing love. He mentions it again in Hilchos Mezuzah. He says, whenever you go into and out of the house and you see the mezuzah, it reminds you internalize something. And then the third time it says making brachos, when you make blessings, and especially because your attitude has to be, as the rabbis say, that you bless God for the bad things just as the good things, and you have an attitude of thankfulness. And there too he mentions love. So those are going to be the practical things in the second book, but right now we're still focusing on the cognitive aspects. So that, I hope, shows how the theme of love structures the entire book, Sefer HaMadah, and shows why there are differences of presentation with Sefer HaMitzvahs, which is a systematic treatise. but there's no inconsistency of actual doctrine, I don't think. It's the same idea, but here it's arranged in terms of the order of values. Okay, so now I want to turn to what Rambam says about the two esoteric subject matters of Torah, which are Maseh Bereshis, the account of creation, and Maseh Merkava, which is the account of the chariot. So he tells us that the first two chapters, which we've been looking at, of Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, are concerned with Maseh Merkava. They're concerned with the account of the chariot, whereas the chapters 3 to 5, which we didn't talk about yet, are to do with Maseh Bereshis. These terms come from a Mishnah in Masechta Chagiga, which restricts the ways in which certain subject matters are to be taught. Sensitive subject matters. So the Mishnah says, Ein darshin ba'aroyas b'shlosha, one may not expound the laws of forbidden sexual relations before 3 people. One way to explain that is that you're going to have at least 2 of those people are going to be nudging each other. Even if you get one person's attention, 2 of them are going to be nudging each other and giggling and passing notes, and you're not going to be able to get everybody's attention all at once. V'lo b'maseh bereshis b'shnayim, and not the account of creation before 2. V'lo b'merkava b'yochid, and not the divine chariot even before 1. Ela im kein hu haya chacham umevin midato, unless that one individual is wise and can understand from his own knowledge, understand spontaneously. In other words, such a person, you don't have to tell them the whole story. You can give them a few hints and they'll figure out the rest themselves. It has to be an active knowledge on their part and not just passive reception. Okay, so what are these 2 things that the Mishnah is talking about? By the way, I said 2 because Rambam does not associate any esoteric meaning to this forbidden sexual relations. To the Kabbalists, that is a 3rd esoteric subject matter. There are 3 esoteric subjects. He has, as far as I know, an entirely prosaic, literal understanding about the forbidden relations. So you would think that Maseh Bereshis means the section of the Chumash that deals with creation, perhaps along with supplementary traditional works that explain creation.
Like Bereshis. And Bereshis.
Yeah, that's right. But in addition, works like Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, and so on. You would think that Maseh Merkava deals with the prophetic vision of the chariot. Again, perhaps supplemented by other works. There's a whole literature of those who are Yesodei Merkava, go down into the chariot. It's a kind of heavenly ascent literature. But Rambam does not understand it that way. Yes?
I'm not familiar with the account of the chariot.
Yes.
What is that?
Well, there's a prophetic vision of a divine chariot.
Okay.
But what exactly that means,
Okay.
there are a number of different interpretations.
Is he talking about Yechezkel?
Yeah,
Yes.
Yechezkel.
Okay.
Right.
Yechezkel.
So here I've given you a little bit of Rambam's commentary on the Mishnah. And this is obviously my translation. He wrote it in Arabic, but this is a translation from the Hebrew translation of the Arabic. He says, "And hear from me, I myself." There's an emphasis on the first person singular, which is very uncommon in Rambam's prose. What has become clear to me in accordance with my knowledge? I think he wants to say this is his idea. In what I have investigated of it from the words of the wise, and that is that they refer by account of the creation to the sciences of nature and the investigation of the principle of creation. So he's saying Maseh Bereshis is physics. It is the study of nature. And by account of the chariot, they intend the divine science, that is to say, metaphysics, the study of divinity. So as I read Rambam here, he's saying a chiddush, he's saying his own innovation, saying, I am telling you that Maseh Bereshis is physics, and Maseh Merkava is metaphysics. And that's a very radical move. So to the best of my knowledge, no Jewish philosopher, and Jewish philosophy had already existed for a long time, had ever said such a thing. It's an extremely radical move. He says, which is the discourse concerning the general principles of the existence of the Creator and his knowledge and his attributes, and the necessity with which creatures relate to him, and the angels, and the soul, and the intellect that clings to man, and what is after death, and so on. And he will therefore identify the restrictions on the teaching of these two subjects in Mishnah Chagiga with the restrictions that the philosophers put on the teaching of physics and metaphysics to those who are not adequately prepared. So, what we'll see later on is even more radically than that. Rambam will say that study of physics and metaphysics is higher in value than the study of halacha. And again, this goes with what we were saying before. He hasn't introduced the particular yet, which is not to say the particular is not important, but it comes later in the order of values. In the order of education, the study of halacha has to come first. Right? So he will say, if you haven't filled your stomach, is the metaphor that he uses, you haven't first learnt what's permitted and what's forbidden, then obviously you're not ready to understand physics and metaphysics. You first have to have control of yourself. You have to know how to behave. You have to know discipline.
Does he associate that with Pirkei Avot? Because no, nothing at all. Because he gives a lot of translations of Pirkei Avot.
No, that deals with the subject matter of Hilchos Deos, which we didn't get to yet, which is about how to acquire the virtues.
How to acquire.
Yes, how to have cognitive control over one's actions. But that's general ethics. That's not halacha in particular. Halacha is a very specific form of that. You have to have ethical traits in the first place. So what I would say is that the study of halacha has to come first, but nevertheless, there's a way in which it's important to emphasize the orientation of this education towards the goal, even from the outset. So I don't think he's saying that you should, you just teach people in a very harsh way. This is permitted, that's forbidden, and then when they get to a certain age, you say, oh, now I'm going to introduce you to the wonders of nature, and you should love God. I don't think it goes like that, right? The way I understand it, the whole education has to be in a spirit of love in the first place, right? There must, just as with parenting a child, there has to be a general atmosphere of love before anything like discipline or other educational elements are introduced. If it isn't, right, and the point is to get to love, to get this person, this small person, eventually to the point where they can also love, right? But if it's not introduced in the spirit of love in the first place, with an orientation towards that goal, then just giving them the discipline is not going to be sufficient. So I would say that even though it's true that you have to learn the halachas before you really come to that love of God, which is what he said at the end of Hilchos Tshuva, you would have to bear in mind, as an educator and as the Torah does, and as he does in this book, that the general goal of love and the attitude of love has to be borne in mind first.
Is that what they do when they teach now? No, 50 years ago when they taught? In, yeshiva, I don't think they had that concept.
The Cheder, they didn't.
They didn't. That's what I'm thinking.
Depends where and which teachers.
They had the stick.
Right.
But we always hear about the ruler and the stick.
Maybe 7 years ago.
We read in Marta's book that there was love.
Okay, so now we're going to look at the beginning of Rambam's discussion of the basic principles of philosophy and how to understand the world. We've talked about why you need to do it, but now we're going to actually do it. So in the second chapter of Yesodei HaTorah, third halacha, he introduces 3 divisions of beings. So we have to understand that according to Aristotle, there is form and there is matter. Form is morphe in Greek, and matter is hule. So there are beings that are hylomorphic, that is to say they are combinations of form and matter. The first kind of being is hylomorphic and transient. That is to say, it's composed of form and matter, and it comes into being and it passes away. So these are beings that are made of sublunary matter, that is to say, the kind of matter that you find down here on Earth, below the sphere of the moon, that's made of earth, air, fire, and water, the different elements. And then you take that matter, as it were, that matter has impressed upon it a form that determines what kind of thing it is. So everything is made of matter down here, but things are of different kinds. And what makes them into the kind that they belong to is the form that the thing has. So obviously that's a species, a division of being that Aristotle would also agree to. So that's the first kind of being. The second kind of being is also hylomorphic. It's got both form and matter, but it's enduring. It does not come to be and then pass away like things down here on Earth. So the spheres, the celestial bodies themselves, seem to be lasting. They don't seem to come into being or pass away. If you believe in creation, which is a fundamental Jewish belief, then you will believe that God created them by will and could annihilate them by will as well. But they don't naturally pass away. They don't die. And they're not born. But they're also hylomorphic. They're not made of sublunary matter. They're made of superlunary matter. We don't know what that is. It's presumably quite different from the kind of matter we have down here on Earth. It's not composed of the same elements. But they still have a form that determines their species. And again, that's something that Aristotle would also agree with. The third kind of being, however, Aristotle would almost certainly not agree exists. Third kind of being is just form alone. That's something that Plato agrees to, and Rambam, given that he has a highly Platonic interpretation of Aristotle, thinks that Aristotle would agree to it. So purely formal beings, without any matter whatsoever, Rambam says, we call them angels. They're the malachim. They are incorporeal, they have no bodies, they are just pure form. And I just note there as well that in the Guide of the Perplexed Part 1, Chapter 37, Rambam cites the standard Aramaic translation, Targum Onkelos, of Shmos Lamed Gimel Pasuk Kaf Gimel. Now remember that is a very important passage which we've already seen Rambam talk about. That's where Moshe asks to be shown the divine presence, the divine face, and God says, no, you can't do that, but you stand here in the cleft of the rock, and so on. The way Onkelos explains that pasuk is not that you shall not see my face, because Onkelos does not want to even make it sound remotely like God has a face. Rather, Onkelos says, Udekamei lo yitzchazun, and those who are in front of me shall not be seen. And Rambam says, you know what Onkelos means? He means the angels. Angels are the ones who are in the presence of God. They are the separate intellects. They're just intellect, just form, without any matter whatsoever. So just like we cannot understand God's essence, so too, although they're on a lower level, we can't understand the angels. Because fundamentally, we are hylomorphic beings. We are both body and intellect. Our form is the intellect. Right? Other animals have other forms. But our intellect can never totally transcend our body while we're alive. After we die, maybe another story. Right? But while we're alive, we cannot grasp pure intellect. We can't grasp pure form. Therefore, we cannot grasp not only God, but we can't grasp angels either. We can only infer that they exist by means of physics and metaphysics in the same way that we infer that God exists. So Rambam then moves on.
That's not going to be a problem.
What?
But how can they sometimes take form, like in next week's parsha?
Yes.
Like how do you?
Well, Rambam explains that in terms of the faculty of the imagination. So human beings have a faculty of the imagination which gives sensible shape to intellectual ideas.
Are you telling me that the angels that came to Abraham were
But they're imaginative, but they speak, so that's a product of my imagination. Anything
Yes.
that's matter related would be imaginative.
So in the
Do they
prophetic,
actually speak, or is it
Well,
already
They
in your mind?
in the
When
in
they
your,
speak, they tell
Out loud?
Avram. They tell
Or it's in
Avram.
your mind?
it's in your mind.
It's in your mind.
The prophetic vision, which we'll see later on,
They say the word also.
it involves someone whose intellect is so developed that they have some kind of apprehension of the purely intellectual, but usually it's our senses that influence our imagination, as it were, coming up from below. But in a case like that, in a prophetic case, the imagination receives the intellectual content from above, and it gives sensible form to intellectual ideas.
So it's like when you have a lot of pictures moving fast and it looks like it's motion, but it's just really, like, your mind takes, creates a reality, sort of.
Yes, but this is it is a genuine reality. It's just the shape in which it is made intelligible.
But what about the unshaped stone who didn't have a high level of intellect, and also
And they saw them too. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know how he explains that particularly. I haven't thought about it, but yeah. In general, he thinks that prophetic experiences, and that would include experiences of angels, are imaginative experiences. But that we should be careful here, because to say they're imaginative is not to say they're just made up, right? It's like there may be some meanings which transcend the literal meanings of words, which can only be expressed poetically. And there are some visions, and I mean that in the intellectual sense, which transcend our ability to express ourselves and to make ourselves understood, which we can nevertheless, to a certain extent, express and understand by means of images. And that's the role of the imagination for the prophet. Of course, the one great exception to that is going to be the prophecy of Moshe. Moshe has a purely intellectual understanding to the extent that it's possible for a human being. And Moshe, what comes through the divine revelation to Moshe is not images, it's laws. That's the highest level that's a legislative prophecy.
I ask you about when the angels told Abraham and Sarah that you were going to have a child.
Yeah.
How was that image?
Yes.
Imagination?
Yeah. So that's an intellectual experience based on an understanding of nature of what is going to happen. And Rambam believes that the intellects govern, they're as it were God's deputies by means of which the natural order is governed. And a person who understands the intellect sufficiently will be able to understand the future. Will be able to predict the future. But angels are incorporeal forces. They're forces that are at work in the physical world. So in the 4th to the 8th halacha of the 2nd chapter, he tells us more about these angels and emphasizes again, angels are incorporeal, right? They're pure form, so they have no matter, no body at all. So then how do they differ from one another, right? In the Aristotelian worldview, two things differ from one another in one of two ways. If two things belong to two different species, like let's say a human being and a cow, then they differ in form as well as in matter. But now suppose you've got two things of the same species. Two human beings have the same form, but still they differ in matter. But then how can angels differ from one another? Right? Because they got no matter, but they have the same form. Then it sounds like you would not be able to differentiate them. So Rambam says they differ in rank. There's a hierarchy of angels. And what is that hierarchy based on? As we'll see, it's based on the degree to which they cognize God. The degree of cognition.
So Gabriel, meaning Michael, Smoli Gabriel, each of these angels have a different level of how they understand God.
Yes, there are different kinds of angels. He gives us 10 different ranks, and he assembles all these different names from the various prophetic works. The lowest level are the Ishim, and those are the ones who are seen in visions, like the angels that you were talking about, who came to Lot and so on. And they are at the lowest level. They are the intellects that are responsible for giving form to the world that we live in. So they are forces that give form to sublunary matter. But then there are all these other levels going all the way up, right? The Kruvim, the Bnei Elohim, the Elohim, Malachim, Seraphim, Chashmalim, Erelim, Ophanim, Chayos. And by the way, you find in works of other religions too, different attempts to rank the angels in different ways and to sort out all the different terms. It's a common preoccupation in the medieval philosophical literature. So I think that the number is probably not accidental. What we're going to see eventually is that there are 9 different spheres around the earth, and although I couldn't find any text where he says it explicitly, maybe there is one. It seems to me very likely that these different ranks of angels are associated with the different levels of the spheres. Because each sphere is also associated with a separate intellect. And as I say, in chapter 4, Halacha 6, he does say that the Ishim, which are the lowest ones, they are responsible for forming hylomorphic beings down here in the sublunary realm. So they would be associated with the lunar sphere, in other words. And they would have force, they would exert force, formative force, on that which is below them. And the general way this is understood, or Rambam doesn't say it here, is that each intellect would understand God and itself, and whatever is above it. So each intellect is, so the highest ones, which are the Chayos, right, they have the closest apprehension of God, right? Because they understand God the most directly. The next ones can only understand God by first understanding the Chayos, and then they can understand God, and so on and further down. And I think they're probably associated with the different spheres around the earth that we'll talk about next time. And then, the final point, right? The Rambam talks about how God knows God's self, divine self-cognition, because he wants to emphasize that there is no cognition, no matter how great, even the cognition that the angels are capable of, which compares to God's cognition of God's self. Right? And this is very interesting from the point of view of a comparison with Aristotelian metaphysics. So, how does it work? We are hylomorphic, right? We are both matter and form. We can't have any direct cognition of God at all, because we are not capable of separating our intellects from our bodies in a way that would be required to grasp a separate intellect, let alone to grasp God. We can make an inference from the infinite motive force that's required to move the outermost sphere to an infinite cause. But that's not a direct apprehension. Like the most you could have would be what Moshe attained, which was, as it were, seeing God from behind, but not a direct apprehension of God's essence.
So when it says Moshe saw Hashem panim al panim,
It doesn't say that.
what does it say?
It says that God spoke to Moshe.
Moshe panim al
Oh,
panim.
no, right. So that means that, on the Rambam's view, that there's a direct communication which does not pass through the imagination. There's a direct intellectual communication, but it does not mean that Moshe grasps God's essence by his intellect. It means that he managed to separate his intellect from his imagination, which other human beings have not been capable of doing, even the prophets. So, what is God's cognition of God's self like? Obviously, we can't explain it in any positive way, but we can still say something about it. I didn't put this down here. 1 second. Right, so I didn't put this down in the handout, but this is the 10th halacha of the second chapter. HaKadosh Baruch Hu makir amito. God recognizes his own truth, his own essence. V'yodea osa kamo shehi, and he knows it as it is. Right? God is the only one who can do that. Even a separate intellect can't do that. Ve'enu yodea b'das shehi chutz mimenu. He does not know it through b'dea, I should say, shehi chutz mimenu. He doesn't know it through a knowledge which is separate from him. Right? Remember that God is infinite, and therefore there can't be any distinctions that pertain to God at all. When I know something, there's a property of knowledge that I have acquired. There's a capacity for knowledge that I have actualized. And there are distinctions that have to be introduced to understand that. I am not the same as the property of knowledge. I can exist without it, and it can exist without me. And my capacity for knowledge can exist either in a state of potential or in a state of actualization. But it's not so with God. There are no such distinctions. So if we say that God knows, we have to be careful to realize we're not saying there's some property that's distinct from God. God's knowledge is God's self. Right? So he doesn't know by means of a knowledge that is separate from him. Kamosha anu yodin, as we know. She'ein anu v'deotenu echad, because we and our knowledge are not one. Aval habore hu v'dato v'chayav echad, mikol tzadeh mikol pina. But the Creator, he and his knowledge and his life are all one in every aspect and from every point of view. If he were to be living with a distinguishable life or knowing with a distinguishable knowledge, hayusham elahos harbeh, there would be many divinities, God forbid. Hu v'chayav v'data, each one of those things would be distinguishable and they'd all be divine. So you'd have a plurality of gods. That would be polytheism. But monotheism cannot allow for that. Ve'ein hadavar kain, this is not the case. Elachom mikol tzana mikol pina, u'b'chol derech yichud. But one from every aspect, every point of view, and in every mode of unity. We saw earlier that unity really here means infinity. Right? So, nimtseis omer, so we see that it should be said, Hu hayodea, he is the one who knows, v'hu hayodua, he is the one who is known, v'hu hadea atzma, and he is the knowledge itself, hakol echad, they're all one. That's a very famous statement, which is based on a philosophical statement of Al-Farabi, the great Islamic philosopher. And I think I'm going to leave till next time the implications of this for providence, for the exercise of providence over the world. And I'll just leave it as a question. In Aristotle's metaphysics book, Lambda, God is said to be the thought that thinks itself, the intellect that intellects itself. And the implication would seem to be that God cannot be occupied with anything lower than himself because it would be beneath his dignity. So it would appear that Aristotle's God, so understood, could not care less about us. Presumably, one would think, and one would be right in thinking, that's not a consequence that Rambam wants. So how will Rambam maintain this Aristotelian sounding a conception of God with the idea that God exercises providence and cares about us? And that's what I'll start with next time.
I take this.
Sure.
That was
What about
amazing.
that